Understanding Perception, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Initially, I become aware of an object as a unified whole and must grasp it in its true character. If, during the process of perceiving it, something contradictory arises, I recognize it as a reflection of my own mind. As I perceive the object, various properties emerge that seem to be inherent to the object itself. However, the object remains a singular entity, and I am aware that the diversity of properties, which could potentially cause it to cease being a unified whole, exists within me. In reality, the object's whiteness is only apparent to my eyes, its tartness to my tongue, and its texture to my touch, and so on. The entire range of diverse properties is not derived from the object itself, but from my own perception. These properties diverge in this way because my senses, eyes, tongue, and others are distinct and separate. As a result, I become the universal medium in which these diverse properties coexist, each existing independently. By acknowledging that I am this universal medium, I preserve the self-identity and truth of the object as a unified whole. In section 119, Hegel is poised to make a significant transition. Up until this point, the discussion has focused primarily on objects, with consciousness playing a somewhat secondary role, parasitically dependent on the object. However, as we've seen, consciousness is actually the central aspect, even if it occasionally loses sight of this and attributes the primary role to the object. As an idealist, Hegel is about to bring things within the scope of consciousness. We are on the cusp of witnessing an important transition, not in its entirety, but at least in its initial stages. So, let's examine this incipient movement and the principles that underlie it. What does Hegel remind us of at the very beginning of this section? It reads similarly to previous sections. Initially, I perceive the object as a unified whole, grasp it in its true character, and if something contradictory arises during perception, I recognize it as a reflection of my own mind. Any form of deception, particularity, or error is attributed to me. I bear responsibility for it. The object simply is what it is, or does it? Hegel continues by noting that various properties emerge during perception. At this point, he raises a crucial question. Where do we actually perceive these properties? Are they inherent in the object itself, or do we perceive them? Let's use an example to illustrate this point. Consider this blue cloth, which is soft, has a certain ductility or flexibility, a specific size, and a particular feel to it. You might even be able to hear the sound of it rustling. Are these properties inherent in the object, or are they part of our perception of it? This distinction is a recurring theme in modern philosophy, often referred to as the difference between primary and secondary qualities, a concept that Locke discussed extensively, although he was not the first to propose it. Some qualities genuinely belong to an object itself, while others exist only in the way we perceive that object. Take sweetness, for instance. Is sweetness an inherent feature of something like honey, or is it simply a result of how we experience it? The sweet taste of honey comes from certain sugars, such as glucose, sucrose, or fructose. The exact type of sugar in honey isn't crucial for this discussion, though someone might point it out. The important thing is that while honey contains these chemicals, the chemicals themselves don't possess a taste in any objective sense. Sweetness arises only when a conscious being, like a person, perceives it. This idea can be extended to other properties as well. When we perceive an object, we often attribute various characteristics to it, like calling honey sticky, gooey, sweet, or amber-colored. Even though honey can come in different colors, the point remains, these qualities, as we experience them, don't exist independently in the object. Instead, they are shaped by our perception. The variety of properties we notice is actually a product of our consciousness. To clarify, think about how we use our senses. Honey appears white or amber to our eyes, tastes sweet or tart to our tongue, and feels sticky to our touch. Each sense organ, eyes, tongue, skin, detects different aspects of the same object. The diversity of these sensory experiences doesn't come from the object alone, but from the way we, as perceivers, interact with it. Through our senses, we gather these different impressions and combine them into a mental image or concept of the object, whether it's something we see, touch, or taste. This separation of properties happens because our senses are distinct from one another. Our eyes are different from our tongue, and so on. In this way, human beings, those who perceive, act as the universal medium through which these properties are brought together. While it might seem that the object itself is the universal medium, as some philosophers have suggested, Hegel argues that the object is actually a unified whole. The true universal medium for the diversity of properties is our own consciousness. It's through our perception that we experience an object in multiple ways, and then synthesize those experiences into a single, unified understanding. For example, we might perceive salt as both white and grainy, or a piece of fabric as blue, soft, and fluttering. These qualities are not simply waiting inside the object to be discovered. Rather, we contribute to their existence by perceiving and interpreting them. The object itself will never separate or reveal these properties on its own. It is only through our interaction and perception that these diverse qualities come to light and are unified in our experience. In essence, there exists a unity among various elements. When we consider the idea of a universal medium, it serves as a reflection of our understanding, which enables us to maintain the self-identity of an object. This concept of unity implies that we, as conscious beings, play a crucial role in defining what an object is. Our perceptions, abilities, and the activities we engage in contribute to the characteristics of these objects, allowing them to exist as distinct entities within a universal context. For instance, the color white is defined in contrast to black. It is only through this opposition that we can understand what white truly is. Each object is identified as a singular entity precisely because it stands in contrast to others. However, this does not mean that a singular object excludes others. Rather, being a singular entity involves a universal relationship of self-reference. In fact, the uniqueness of an object is what connects it to all other objects. Objects are inherently determinate, possessing specific properties that allow them to differentiate themselves from one another. These properties are intrinsic to the object itself, not merely defined by their relationships with other objects. For example, an object has a set of characteristics that define its essence, which exists independently of other objects. Moreover, these defining properties arise from a multitude of interrelated elements that differentiate themselves reciprocally. Thus, within the essence of a singular object, its properties exist independently of one another. In this way, an object can be described as white, cubical, or tart, among other attributes. Essentially, the object serves as a universal medium where various properties coexist without negating or interfering with each other. As we delve into Section 120, it may appear that we are regressing to previous ideas discussed in Section 119, where we began to explore consciousness. However, this is not a mere repetition. Rather, it is part of a broader framework that Hegel is constructing to guide us toward a deeper understanding of the conscious subject. He begins by emphasizing that these diverse aspects, which consciousness acknowledges, are distinctly defined. This distinction means that each aspect is unique in its own right, and they're differentiated in various ways. For example, white is recognized as white only in relation to its opposite, black. This relationship is crucial for understanding the nature of these properties. When we talk about qualities like hardness, softness, chalkiness, tastiness, or bitterness, we are essentially discussing colors, which are defined in relation to one another. For instance, red stands in contrast to green, white, and black. It is identified by what it is not. However, it is also distinct from the scent of roses, which adds another layer to its uniqueness. The essence of any object or concept is defined by its opposition to others. Each entity, each individual unit, is recognized as a singular entity precisely because it is not something else. For example, chalk is not a book, a tie, a person, or a camera. We could continue this list indefinitely. Even two copies of the same book are not identical. They possess unique characteristics. For instance, one copy might be in Dr. Sandler's possession at this moment, which is a contingent property that differentiates it from another copy you might be reading. The author emphasizes that being a singular entity does not merely mean excluding others. Rather, it involves a universal relationship of self to self. This concept is something we have encountered before. The fact that something is one makes it comparable to other things. We can discuss unity in a broader sense, recognizing that every individual object is, in fact, an individual object. However, simply labeling something as an individual object does not provide much insight, as every object falls into that category. Ironically, the more we focus on specific details, the more we may inadvertently drift into a vague generality that lacks substance. The author points out that the uniqueness of an object arises from its specific characteristics, which serve to exclude others. This leads us to examine how an object is defined by its properties. Hegel cleverly plays with the term eigen, which means one's own or proper, and connects it to the word for property, Eigenschaft. This highlights the idea that an object's essence is tied to its specific properties. These properties are not only differentiated from opposites, such as white and black, but also from one another. For example, the whiteness of salt is distinct from its tartness and its granularity. This serves as a reminder of concepts we have previously discussed. In essence, objects exist as determinate entities, possessing properties that allow them to distinguish themselves from others. Since these properties are intrinsic to the object, they define its uniqueness. An object cannot exist without properties. Without them, it would be an empty void, lacking any defining characteristics. When you cannot directly indicate something, it becomes challenging to express it with intention or to discuss it using language. This leads us to consider the nature of truth itself. The speaker introduces 3 distinct conditions that will be explored regarding this concept. First and foremost, what is true possesses an intrinsic existence. The essence of a thing is inherent to it and does not rely on external factors. For instance, consider chalk. Its whiteness is an essential characteristic that defines what chalk is. This quality is integral to the chalk's identity and contributes to its overall unity. The same principle applies to any other objects that we differentiate in our consciousness and in reality. Secondly, the defining properties of a thing do not merely exist because of other entities or for their sake. Rather, they exist within the thing itself. These properties are present because they are part of a complex interplay of elements that differentiate one another. To clarify, each property is unique and distinct from others, meaning that the whiteness of the chalk is not the same as its cubical shape, and vice versa. They are defined by their differences, much like how 2 objects can push against each other without annihilating one another. If these properties were to completely separate, we would lose the concept of the object itself, resulting in a lack of unity. It is this tension among the properties that allows us to recognize the chalk as a cohesive entity with identifiable characteristics. Thirdly, these properties exist independently and for themselves, remaining indifferent to one another. Each property can be thought of as a small universe in its own right. For example, the whiteness of the chalk exists as it is, focused solely on its own identity. In a metaphorical sense, one might say that the whiteness is solely concerned with being white, while the cubical shape is only focused on being cubical. Each property is indifferent to the existence of the other, and they do not rely on our perception to validate their existence. Thus, the properties exist independently and for their own sake, remaining indifferent to one another. In essence, the chalk is both white and cubical, among other attributes. This means that the object is not only a unified whole but also serves as a universal medium where various properties coexist without interfering with or negating each other. When viewed in this light, the object is recognized as embodying what is true. All of this occurs within the realm of the unconscious, which is engaged in the act of perception. In this process, consciousness simultaneously recognizes that it is reflecting upon itself. As it perceives, an opposing moment also emerges. This opposing moment represents the unity of the object with itself, a unity that inherently excludes any differences from itself. Therefore, it is this unity that consciousness must embrace, as the object itself embodies a collection of various and independent properties. For instance, we can describe an object as being white, cubical, and tart, among other attributes. However, when we consider it as white, it cannot simultaneously be cubical, and when it is cubical and white, it cannot also be tart, and so forth. The task of consciousness is to assert these properties as a cohesive whole while preventing them from merging into a singular identity within the object. To achieve this, consciousness maintains the properties as distinct and external to one another, while also recognizing the object as a whole. In this context, consciousness initially assumes responsibility for the unity by representing what we call properties as free matter. Consequently, the object is elevated to a genuine whole, transforming from a singular entity into a mere enclosing surface. In section 121, we will observe the active role of consciousness becoming more prominent. Hegel explains that in this mode of perception, consciousness is aware of its own reflection. This concept may not be entirely new, but it is essential to understand its implications. When Hegel mentions the emergence of the opposing moment, he refers to the object as a collection of properties that exist in a sort of chaotic mixture, where they do not interfere with or connect to one another. The opposing moment signifies the unity of the object with itself, a concept we have encountered before. This unity represents a dynamic process in which the object, like everything else in Hegel's philosophical framework, becomes other to itself, thereby introducing inherent tensions. This is where things become particularly interesting. Hegel asserts that this movement signifies the unity of the object with itself, a unity that deliberately excludes differences from itself. Other objects are indeed different, and this unity is what consciousness must internalize. The object itself is the existence of many diverse and independent properties. So, how does consciousness accomplish this? Here, we will witness significant active contributions from consciousness. Many individuals tend to view Hegel through the lens of Kant, and this is one area where Kant's ideas can be particularly illuminating. Kant, among others, argued that our minds play an active role in shaping our perceptions. The order and structure we observe in external objects are not necessarily inherent to those objects. Rather, they are constructs of our own cognition. Through the faculty of understanding, we are imposing our interpretations onto objects. In doing so, we are absorbing them, even while sensibility plays a role to some degree. Understanding, in this context, is incredibly significant. However, Hegel isn't particularly concerned at this stage with separating these concepts. Instead, he discusses them in terms of consciousness. He suggests that the object itself consists of diverse and independent attributes. For instance, when we describe something as white, we're referring to its property of whiteness. Similarly, it may also be cubic, tart, and so on. Now, Hegel introduces the term insofar, or so far, which, if we wanted to play around with word meanings, might evoke the idea of distance or separation, though we don't necessarily need to dwell on that right now. Still, it's an intriguing thought to consider. Hegel explains that insofar as something is white, it is not cubic. This observation highlights how these properties differentiate from one another. The pressing question then becomes, how do these distinct properties coexist in unity? That's the key issue we've been grappling with. There's a tension here because, on one hand, the object strives for unity, but on the other, its properties must remain distinct. As such, the object can't achieve perfect unity. Instead, it functions more like a universal medium where these properties are free to manifest themselves individually. Where does the truth lie? It fluctuates between these two poles, doesn't it? We're trying to hold on to both ends of the truth simultaneously, which is always challenging. Hegel asserts that positing these properties as a unified whole is an act performed by consciousness alone. The object itself doesn't posit or think about these properties. While the object could theoretically bring them into unity, it remains relatively passive in this process. It is consciousness that actively posits the object as a unified entity, effectively bestowing unity upon it. In German, this concept is captured by the term Einsatzung, which means taking the properties and integrating them into a single unity, in eins. Of course, there are limits to what we can model conceptually, but each property is absorbed into the object through this active positing by consciousness. Each property is understood as intrinsic to the object, connected to other properties, and contributing to the overall unity. This unity represents how the object relates to itself. Importantly, the object doesn't accomplish this on its own. It's consciousness that performs this unifying function with the object and its properties. Recognizing this marks a significant achievement. It underscores the activity of consciousness. But Hegel doesn't stop there. He continues by explaining that this activity extends further. To this end, he introduces the notion of insofar. Where does this insofar come into play? It operates at the level of the properties, serving to differentiate them from one another. Think of it as placing a boundary between this property and that property, distinguishing each one from the others. I realize this is getting a bit tangled, but you get the gist. The insofar delineates. Insofar as this property exists, it is distinct from others. Consciousness plays a dual role, simultaneously contributing to both unity and difference. This raises an intriguing question. How can something embody both a quality and its opposite at the same time? This is where we can observe the workings of the Hegelian system. In this framework, a concept inherently calls for its opposite. But what enables this dynamic? It is not the objects themselves that possess this capability. Rather, it is consciousness that facilitates this interaction. This idea echoes Aristotle's assertion that the soul encompasses all things in a certain manner, allowing it to hold opposites concurrently. In contrast, objects alone lack this ability. Hegel further elaborates on this by stating that consciousness assumes responsibility for its actions. The term responsibility reappears here, emphasizing its significance. Initially, properties are viewed as free matter, substances that possess their own agency. Hegel argues that when we elevate our understanding of these properties, they transform into a genuine collection of matters. Instead of being perceived as a singular entity, they become merely an enclosing surface. This leads us to a continual balancing act between two perspectives, the unity of the object and its properties. If we choose to concentrate on the object itself, we must regard it as a unified whole, with its properties serving a subordinate role. Conversely, if we wish to appreciate the properties for what they truly are, we must view the object as an indifferent medium, reflecting another indifferent medium. This shift in focus highlights the differences instead. All of this complexity arises from the agency of consciousness, which we have now begun to explore.